Hello, hello.
Hi there.
How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. How's it going?
It's going really good, really good. I'm excited that we get to talk today. It's gonna be very informal. So for everybody joining, we're gonna have a friends conversation today. Just trying to talk through things, interests that we have in common, concerns that we have in common. I want to introduce you to Tameka Vasquez, obviously, who is a futurist and the founder of the Future Quo, which I'm super, super, super curious to know more about. And there will be people joining. There will be comments that I may be able to bring on the screen. Tameka, maybe we can answer certain questions. Yeah. And for everybody who may get to catch up with the recording, we'll be happy to answer any questions on the comments as well.
That sounds
so great. Let's talk about humans and what is going on in the world today. Tameka, why don't you give us an introduction? Who you are, what's your business about, what is your passion, what are you concerned with?
Yeah. So hi, everyone. I'm Tameka Vasquez. I started this practice 2 years ago to help us reimagine and just have a different conversation about the future. My background has been in the technology space. I spent about close to 14 years working for a variety of tech startups and larger tech enterprises. And I was doing marketing and business development strategy work. So a lot of my job was to communicate the possibilities of a future once you buy this product and what that's able to help you transform or able to help you do. So coming from that background, a lot of the focus was on technology and technology's promise. And when I decided to start this practice, I wanted to put a different spin on this conversation because I know that technology is a big part of how we think about our future, but technology is just one part. And there's a whole host of other things that we might want to consider as part of our wider human experience. And I wanted to offer a space to help organizations and leaders think about that. So the Future Quo was born out of a desire to just have a different conversation about the future. I know there are lots of leaders and organizations out there who really care about where this is all going and who are trying to design products or services or just new ideas in general that serve people and serve the planet. And it begins with really just having a vision for what that future could be. So that's a lot of what we focus on in my practice is developing that kind of vision, is identifying where might there be possibilities or signals that the world can go in a different direction and that it should. And how do you start to align stakeholders and other people with that vision so you can actually take action. So that's a lot of what I focus on now as in my capacity, practicing as a futurist and bringing that strategic lens to that conversation.
I think it's beautiful. I think the work you're doing, people don't know, but we've had many conversations
Yeah.
behind the scenes about, the beauty that it is to think about, humanity at large and how much is to be done and where we're headed, especially as you bring up the technology component, all this hype and all these conversations about AI and why not and how revolutionary is it going to be. But at the end of the day, it's still gonna be the regular humans like us
We'll
trying
still be.
to make this world a better place. And I think your work and your lens there is so fundamental. Um, I want to take a step back because your vision, I mean, your whole idea of the future quo, it's probably a little bit ahead of its time, and you're coming in from a perspective where you're trying to cut through the chase to connect all these dots as quickly as possible. But what do you think it's not working with the status quo today?
Mhm. Do you have all day? um,
Well, an hour.
I mean, I'll give like a few things that I actively think about. So I think one of the main things that, especially for organizational leaders, business leaders particularly, one of the main things
Mhm.
that I think it's not immediately obvious to them the ways that their roles are being redefined almost without their permission.
Mhm.
We are living in a time where we have these different sectors of society, right? So you have the private sector, you have business, you have the public sector, government, and then you have all these social sectors like healthcare and education, nonprofits, and all these other spaces. And what is largely happening is that those spaces are converging. You spend enough time in these different arenas and you start to realize, like, okay, a lot of the conversations are basically the same. How you may attack those different um, problems or how you may start to look at these different opportunity spaces may vary, but the conversations that are happening across these sectors are largely the same. And you
Mhm.
have Edelman, for example, who's been running research for like the last couple of decades, looking at the ways
Mhm.
that public trust has shifted also. Um, there are, they've been running these surveys where they survey people from across the world and they try to figure out who do you trust in terms of the institutions that run and govern society. And what they're finding more and more is the public's trust is waning when it comes to the public sector, governments, how people perceive the media, how people perceive nonprofits. And there's a whole host of reasons why, but ultimately that means that trust is beginning to shift more in the direction of businesses. Now, when you kind of unpack that, what you realize is not that people necessarily like inherently trust businesses, but it is a signal that
Mhm.
people are looking for a place to feel like they know what's going on and they're looking for leadership. And so when they see organizations step up and they're able to have a conversation about social justice, or they're able to pay more attention to the impacts that we are seeing with our planet and our climate and our general health, there's something that happens where people are like, oh, you're paying attention. You have something to say about
Mhm.
this. And then to the extent that you can back that up with some commitments, amazing. And so we're starting to see that that trust is shifting. And so what that means is that the status quo thinking of, all right, as a business, we exist to make a profit. As a government, we exist to sign laws and create policies. As a nonprofit, we're here to get donations or whatever. Those roles and how they understand those roles are going to continue to shift. They're already converging, they're already shifting. And so we can no longer just stay in our lane and just pretend that the problems that are happening over there are not our business. Right now, everything is sort of becoming our business. So that's one thing that I think creates an opportunity, because if you are a leader, if you're a business leader in this day and age, now you have a chance to really consider, what is the broader role that I can play in this conversation about the future? How can I participate in areas of humanity that maybe before I wasn't thinking about, or before I didn't think I had to care about, but now it's front and center, and the public is largely depending on leadership at large. So that's like one thing. I think the other thing that I think is very nuanced and it's an opportunity again for us to just kind of think about the way we think. Something I notice a lot is we talk about things as separate to ourselves. So we create these abstractions so that they become talking points that don't force us into an action, that don't force us to confront reality. So for example, we talk about the planet as if it's this separate entity, right? It's a thing to talk about. The planet is the only place we have to live. The planet is our home. So in essence, talking about the planet is talking about your home. It's not a separate line item, you know, or we talk about AI as if it's a thing that's happening. No, it is a tool and it was created by people. It is something that we are actively contributing to in some way, shape, or form. And so I think in terms of this kind of status quo, I look at things in these abstractions, you know, to unpack them, to really figure out where might there be a role for us to play, or how can we start to integrate these things into a conversation so that we actually understand the role of people. We actually understand where might there be opportunity to really reimagine, redesign, reframe, tell a different story. And I think part of it requires not separating ourselves from the things that we are seeing and experiencing. They're very much integral to why we are experiencing the things that we are. So those are just like a couple of quick examples. You know, when I think about like the status quo, those are the types of things that I think about. I don't know, Lindsay, if you had anything that you want to add to that. I know I'm rambling a bit.
No, you're not rambling. I think it's very profound. And what you're making me think about is elevating consciousness. You know, this idea that maybe tap a little bit on the spiritual side, but the reality that we are an interconnected entity, you know, and this idea of separation that you're bringing up has a lot to do with how we see ourselves in relation to our experience of the world at large and our ego, and how that gets in the way of seeing that interconnectedness. And I love that there can be a conversation about this when it comes to positioning business and positioning strategies, right, for companies to function at a more elevated level. You know, even internally, you know, you talk about the separation between us and the planet, but when you look at it internally in an organization, there's separation between this department and the other. And the reality is that everything is the sum of its parts, right?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. I think embracing some of that complexity, because it's a little bit easier to dissect and then create these separations. But I think the more we intend on the more we intend on understanding things, it would allow us to be comfortable with weaving these things together and living at these intersections and allowing that complexity to just expose new forms of truth. And to your point, yeah, that's a little bit of a spiritual journey, but we are also spiritual beings and we can't escape from. The more we try to extract ourselves from these complexities, the more we'll find ourselves lost. You know, I hate saying like, oh, embrace complexity. I hate saying that, but it's really a fundamental truth. And I think to the extent that we're okay with trying that out, you know, if that's not a space that you've occupied previously, just being open to trying that out, to really say to yourself, why are these things happening? And what are the contributing forces to them happening? And how do I actually feel about that? And it's okay to feel whatever you feel, right? But then from that space, you just derived a deeper understanding of where you might be able to play a different role or have a different perspective, or just bring people along into a new way of thinking. But it really just starts with sitting in that complexity and sitting in those intersections and just being open to what you're going to learn on the other side of that experience.
You're also making me think about, when you talk about the role that we can play, what comes up for me is, no matter where we are in, you know, in this ecosystem, right, and the corners that we're coming from as humans, we have the potentiality to be creators.
Oh yeah.
And right. And I mean, you were talking about this in a very generative way, which is some of the things that I care about. So I relate completely with what you're saying. And I'm imagining, right, the role that we have in not only physically, right, as leaders, as founders, as, whatever it is that we do in these different fields, but our roles as humans in using our imagination to create, right? And the level of consciousness that you are inviting us into can bring quality imagination into our minds to externalize it in the form of creation for a better, more interconnected world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I love what you just said. And I think that a lot of the times, the thing that seems the most obvious, I think sometimes is hard for people to grapple with. So, one of the things I
Mhm.
always say to people is the future is not a time or a place. And that's really
Mhm.
hard for people to grapple with. But what I mean when I say that is it's not this inevitable outcome, right? It's not a place that you're going to get to and you just get there, or it's not a magical number that you come up with. The future is not 2030. The future is not any particular time. The future is actually a space of participation. And
Mhm.
I believe that creates a mindset shift that I think is critical to even get people to realize that they can participate in the future, that this is not going to be this linear path and 1 + 1 is going to equal 2 every single time. It's not going to be that straightforward, but that's a good thing because what that then creates is an opportunity for us to then decide if what is happening right now, first of all, if what's happened in our past has led to what is happening right now, then what is happening right now could create different outcomes for a future. And if that's not a future that we are interested in, that we are excited about, that we're hopeful for, well, we get to iterate on some stuff that's happening right now. Right. So I think just being able to recognize that there is a way to actively participate in the design of something that feels very distant but is very much a part of
Yeah.
how we live and how we exist in the world, I think that should be exciting to just have that invitation and have that opportunity to contribute in that way.
I mean, if anything, it sounds like a lot of fun.
It is to me.
If that is if fun is a motivator for people, that conversation you're proposing sounds a lot more fun and a lot more just inspiring in general. That we have the possibility to shift the trajectory of where we're going, and that we have that power that probably we don't think about it every day, but like each of us from our corners have that power to bring in that potentiality into what we do. And then we're coming from different places, and then we create this ripple effect that becomes the norm,
That's
which
exactly
is
it.
the future qual.
That is exactly it. That is why this practice exists, why I've switched careers. It's why I'm
Yeah.
dedicating the foreseeable future to just democratizing that idea and supporting people who care with just some tools. Sometimes people are just missing some tools or some methodologies that they can apply to their environment. But it's exciting to just see the ways that even just that tiny mindset shift really just unlocks people from this like feeling that they're stuck with whatever the outcome is going to be. Like the worst thing we can ever say is the phrase, it is what it is. That's the worst thing we can say because that inherently shuts the door. It's not just what it is. There's more to it. There's an opportunity
Mhm.
for us to unpack and learn and see how that shapes a different perspective that could steer the decisions that you make, the things you decide to invest your time in, the people you spend your time around. There's a way that you can get out of that space of stuckness. And I think that's what motivates me the most is when I see that happen for other people. I'm like, that's the entire point.
Yeah. I'm going to bring up a comment that may trigger another level of these conversations from my friend Paul, who's always super supportive and always, joining these conversations, and also has a very profound way to look at the world. And he's in he has a journey that's as fascinating So he's mentioning, Tameka, do you think a big part of this as well is that ever since COVID, people have woken up, and I've just noticed that more people aren't only prioritizing self-awareness and emotional intelligence yet, and also learning it.
Yeah,
What role does self-awareness, emotional intelligence, spirituality play into all of these from your perspective?
it plays a very, very direct role.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One of the things I'm always interested in, there's an author named Kwame Appiah Anthony, and I'm really interested in his work because he studies identity. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that he unpacks in the realm of identity is the way that your tribe denotes your language, right? So if you're Igbo, you speak Igbo, right? If you're French, you speak French, right? There's a level of that association with how you speak and the way that you think that is directly derived from your tribal affiliation. And so within that, I think what happens for a lot of people is we default to that collective understanding. So when you are in a workplace, that essentially creates an element of identity that you don't have to necessarily create for yourself. It's in a sense prescribed to you in a way. So you get to step into that environment and exist within the realm of this tribe. And that dictates the language, that dictates everything that you do, the behaviors that are normalized in that space. So I think what happens is when you have experiences like COVID, it's certainly not the only one, but it is the most recent that we all experienced together. When you have experiences like that, you no longer get the chance to just default to the tribe, right? Because you are on your own. Most of us were in our homes, sharing that space with our families or our ourselves. And within that, you don't get to just default to a thing. You have to now figure out, okay, well, how do I want to exist on this thing by myself? Even though you know everybody's experiencing it together, but there's no rules of engagement because we had not, within these generations that are currently on the planet, we have not experienced that
There's
together.
no frame of, there's no frame of
There's
reference.
no framework. There's like no blueprint to how to navigate that. And so as a result
Mhm.
of that, I think it created this mirror where we were just like staring at ourselves. I mean, quite literally staring at yourself in this little box on Zoom all day, right? You were doing that.
Mhm.
For many people, it was the first time. But even outside of that, it just forced you to have to like look at the ways that your time was being spent and all of these things that we've discussed at length. And so I think about the fact that, yes, in that, if there was a lack of emotional intelligence, if you didn't really understand what you may have been experiencing, the angst or the languishing, I think as Adam Grant called it, that you may have been experiencing, um, it became hard for you to justify the way that you were spending your time or what you were spending your time on. And so when we were able to then come back into a space of community, for lack of a better word, we were able to go back into these social spaces that we very naturally occupy as people. I think that then shifted the conversations that we were having. And I think that's why you see a lot of transitions have happened in a lot of people's lives. And a lot of organizations are forced to now deal with the repercussions of those transitions, the ways that people want more for themselves, the ways that people are really fed up with some of the status quo, the ways that people were overexposed to the ways that different areas of our societies have worked. Um, and the ways that, the things that you were able to ignore before, you could not ignore it. So, yeah, I think a lot of that elevated a social consciousness almost, again, without our permission. We didn't necessarily opt into that. Some people always existed at that layer, but for many people, it was forced upon them. And we got to see the ways that that may have just made you realize things that you did not realize before and you may not have been ready to fully confront. But it was a forced reckoning for all of us at the same time, but independently outside of our tribes. I
That
hope
is,
that.
I mean, that is fascinating. That was an amazing, segue, because without the tricky part with these conversations is definitely the frame of reference, right? Or maybe to have some kind of seed within you that once these events happen, it kind of triggers the growth that you already know you've been looking for. And so it's not like you learn something new, but you start to confirm things that you already know inside of you, and you start to put it in a context, and you start to understand the language, and it starts to become, it's like coming back home
Yeah.
in the same of the experience. Um, because you had something inside of you that was ready to trigger, and it was ready to be a part of that experience. Paul commented here that the conversation is way over his head, but that he has a point of reference with Elatia about the phrase "remember from the future." And I follow the work of Otto Scrammer from MIT. He is the creator of Theory U. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I think I've seen that.
Um, he has a whole social movement about it, and it's been going on for probably 2 decades now, trying to change the paradigm of awareness and the role that we play in our consciousness plays in understanding and sensing and pre-sensing, as he calls, the future as it emerges. And so I think it's a he also, just like you know, has been ahead of his time, looking at these more complex constructs of what it means to be a human and what it means to interact with humankind, right? Not just human to human, but our entire connection with, you know, every single entity that conforms, right, what it is to be alive in the world.
Yeah.
So yeah, he may be somebody that you would love, also getting deeper into, because I think it'll support a lot of what you're doing, his
Yeah.
teachings and his perspectives.
Definitely
Let me
seems
ask you.
yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating what he does. So where do we go from here? When we, you know, there's a lot being said in terms of pushing humanity forward, and you know, we are at the dawn of, you know, the next revolution in humanity, which obviously involves AI in a lot of the conversations. But what does that look like for you? Like, what does it look like to push humanity forward from here on? For not, let's not count COVID, let's not count AI, from this day into the future.
I mean, I think like a lot of there's so many things, but I think a lot of what actually pushes humanity forward, I think some of those fundamentals are really just stories and ideas, and how those stories and ideas then get passed along, like the game of telephone. So when I think about it, I think we just need new stories of the future. I think it would do a lot for people to just see different iterations of futures. And I use future in the plural tense always, because I believe there are many futures. I don't think it's this linear path where we're just going to have a singular outcome. I think there are many futures that can coexist and allow for us to thrive. But I think it begins with some ideas and some stories. I think a lot of people have ideas and concepts and, you know, things that they may dismiss, you know, because there's a lot of self-limiting beliefs about what people might care about, or, you know, is this going to stick? Is this going to be trendy? Would people understand me? And so I think a lot of those self-limiting beliefs hold people back who may have a divergent perspective, may have a different point of view. Maybe they're really not with this kind of technocentrism. You know, there are a lot of people, like you start talking to enough people and you really start to pick up on a lot of themes of the things that people are saying more quietly. And so I think a lot of how we're going to move humanity forward is by not being so quiet when we disagree with something. And when I say something, I mean something that actually is like right in front of our faces and actively steering the course of where we may go as a society. If you don't believe in that, you don't agree with that, you see all of the reasons why that may create harm or pose threats to humanity, I think we have to be willing to speak up. And I think that in and of itself just evokes a sense of confidence. Like, one, you're not alone. there are lots of people who care about the things that you care about. If we can get together and put that into some language that then can reach a broader group of people, then that's how you spark movement. Everything, if you look at, I like to study like movement leaders and people who have existed over time, whether it's like a Nelson Mandela or a Ho Chi Minh, and you start to see a lot of what they focus on is the narrative. That becomes the first step more often than not, because they understand when you are trying to create large scale movement in a direction, ultimately that requires some kind of articulation, some kind of narrative of what it is that you see. What are you seeing as you are perched from the mountaintop? Is like Martin Luther King said, for example, I've been to the mountaintop. What are you seeing as a result? So I think that that's a big part of how we can move humanity forward. I don't undersell the value of just effective, clear communication and storytelling. And I think within that, we have an opportunity to change our language a little bit. I think I know you appreciate this, Lindsay, and I know a lot of people who are in this humanity-centered space, they also appreciate the ways that our language, oftentimes can evoke this emotion that is not consistent with what we're trying to create. So, for example, in the corporate world, sometimes we're speaking as if we're at war, and we're not. We're not at war, right? We're really trying to support each other and work collaboratively and design things that could benefit society. And so I think a lot of it is like switching the language. There's an organization, I came across this vocabulary of joyful resilience, as they called it. And I'm so obsessed with it. I'll share the link with you. I think the organization is called Zeus Jones, but it seems like a collaborative of some futurists and thinkers as well. And they created this library, this group of words that would allow you an alternative way to speak about certain things. And I think that matters. Like, I think that's a huge part of how we can move humanity forward. And I think the last thing I'll say, because again, there's a million things I could say, but I think the last thing I'll say for the sake of today's conversation is, I think a lot of it is like moving the mindset of, who is a futurist. I think it matters, because I think when we think of who a futurist might be, I think for a lot of people, there's like a direct association to, let's say, a very wealthy tech entrepreneur, for example. That may be the association. I think for me, Harriet Tubman is a futurist, right? Those are the people I think of when I think of a futurist. And I think who we consider to be futurists could in and of itself transform the way that we look at what futures could be. Right? I think because you look at what problems are actually being solved, what resources are being deployed at those problems, like how they collaborate, if there's an open conversation for dissent, if there's a space for people to actually contribute, you start to really see if those principles and practices are there, that is consistent with like a human-centered future, right? But if you see there's sort of like this isolation, or you see this kind of militarized way of thinking and operating, or you see this singular vision that nobody really asked for, that might not be consistent with how I would consider a futurist. I think a futurist is really a person that is really trying to create a world that doesn't yet fully exist, right? But they're trying to actively create that. And it's not for themselves. It's not for the sake of power. It's purely because there is an opportunity to really contribute to human flourishing, contribute to how humanity operates, this wider human experience. And so I think just being able to associate who is actually doing that with who we consider to be a futurist, I think that could do some good as well. I don't know. What do you think about that?
You've given me so much to unpack. We really need like 2 hours. So the first thing that there are 3 things I want to go into with everything you just said. One is speaking up and the act of speaking up. The other one is decolonization as a futuristic value. And the third one is, I want to go back to your point about it's not about power. And those 3 have something in common, which is we live in a socially constructed reality. And the norm, the status quo of that social construct is we live in a social hierarchy,
Yeah.
right? where depending on where you fall, you may or may not hold the keys to the future. And that future may or may not accommodate, right, a sector or two sectors or a good chunk of the rest of humanity. And they may self-propose as futurists, right? They may just go and claim the title, and then we're all stuck in that direction. So let's talk about speaking up. From that reference point, I do a lot of informal advocacy for abuse and bullying and narcissistic abuse in organizations. That is like my sidekick. It's not my day-to-day job, but it's something I care about, and I speak about it every moment I have an opportunity, and I spread awareness every time I get a microphone. Because I think, to your point, it's important to understand the language, it's important to understand the context, it's important to understand the hidden dynamics and how we can shift to be creators of a different way of interacting. I love the idea of being able to speak up and be able to select and work on problems that actually have a magnifying effect and that can move the needle. But what are the consequences of speaking up? How can we, and I don't want to talk about psychological safety. I feel like all those ideas have gone lip service. We need a renaissance of what does it really take to get people to use their voices, to make a movement in the direction of a better future for humanity.
I mean, you're asking a question that, like, my goodness, is such an important question, and it's just.
What is your take? What if you were to
Yeah.
solve the problem? What would be that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it is just giving people permission. I think, I work with leaders where sometimes they're the ones making the decision, and they are still defaulting to somebody else, somewhere else, to basically give them that empowerment or that confidence to say what they believe. And I think that, we live in a world now where I understand why that is. It is very difficult to break through the noise. And I don't mean that in terms of getting attention. I mean that in terms of, it's difficult to get people to understand your intention. It's difficult to get people to understand the meaning behind what you're saying. And so we get really caught up in trying to find the perfect words and, construct it in the perfect context. And those things matter, but it really does get in the way. And so I think, like, we could really do a lot to create supportive environments in any way that we can, to just foster some of that open dialogue. I participated in a program called Better Arguments program. And it is a program as part of the Aspen Institute, who cares a lot about, like, American citizenship and identity and things like that. And the reason they designed this program was because of that. They were trying to figure out, like, what would be some of those core principles that would allow people to not necessarily avoid conflict and be in this kind of avoidance and very politically correct cocoon, but really allow them to have space to have better arguments, to just be able to propose these new ideas. And a lot of it comes from a place of vulnerability, and a lot of it comes from just being able to be in community with shared ideals. And I think what could happen in that space is, I think there could be some commitments of how might we now take this conversation that we had and really be able to put it out in a world in a way that's inviting to more people. Because the one thing I've learned in working with leaders is, more often than not, we tend to agree on a lot of the same stuff. We're just saying it differently. And so I think there's a level of, like, not getting too caught up in jargon sometimes, or not getting too caught up in what we're calling this thing, the latest iteration of what we call this thing, but just to really speak at a human level and to connect with people on just, like, how they feel and how they're navigating this human experience, and, just their own vantage points and their own perspectives, their actual lived experience. And I think being able to just use that to then create invitations to allow other people to say, like, hey, I think there's another way that we could do this. I don't think that this is just what it is. I think there's a way for us to leverage people's cultural backgrounds, and we're a far more globalized society than we've been historically, and I think that's a strength. And I think we need to like leverage that as a strength, where the things that we can learn from people who just come from different walks of life, the things that we can learn from studying the ways that different groups of people have been able to exist in their respective communities, and what are the rules that they follow, and what are the ideologies that they've adapted. Like, there's no right or wrong, it's just plurality, it's just more for us to pick and choose from. And I think, I don't know how we can do that unless people feel like they are in community, they're in some creative, some supportive environment where it's okay that they just disagree. It's okay that they're experiencing a sense of stress, or it's okay that they have a misunderstanding about something. I think we just need to be prepared to support people for just where they're at. And I'm not talking about people who, again, have really bad intentions. I am not talking about that. Like, I'm not in the business of persuasion. I'm really just in the business of like opening the door. And if you walk through the door and you are willing to sit in this with me, now it's our collective job to figure out, how do we get more voices integrated? How do we get more people in a space where they feel like there is something to actually build upon this, right? So there's no one answer, but I really think, at least within the realm of my own work, that's what I at least try to create and what I try to do. And I think that's how, for example, I've really been able to hear things that you would never hear a C-level executive say publicly, but they'll say it to me. And not because I'm special, but simply because I'm offering them a space where my intent is to understand, right? My intent is to support you. And my intent is to care for the people that are in your care as well. And I think just being able to provide that environment is a huge unlock. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I'm
Passionate.
I love it. I'm gonna bring up these comments so you know how powerful it is. Well, everything you're sharing, and Tyler, thank you for being here. I'm so grateful. So this conversation needs to be available on all podcast platforms. This kind of ties to the comment I have to what you just said, which is, I think people are hungry of an elevated conversation too.
Yeah.
I think in the environments that I develop, that I engage in, there is an appetite for conversations that are more intellectual, conversations that have more depth. People are tired of the lip service. People are tired of the same cookie cutter, messages that go from company to company to company to company that you see replicating on LinkedIn posts. I'm somebody who really challenges when people tell me, "Can you say the same thing in 3 bullet points?" And I'm like, no. We need to take a step back and really get used to engaging in conversations that go in depth as to what is it the common argument we're trying to get here. You can't just speaking up. To me, is not just to say what you have in your hand, spit it out. Speaking up needs to have the purpose of coming together into the creation of a new paradigm. And in order to do that, you need to have the faculty of going into depth of the conversations, being able to intellectualize, being able to exchange points of view. And I find the whole elevator pitch and the 3 bullet point summary and say everything in 5 slides absolutely lazy. And I am an active challenger of like, we need to build space for being able to dive deeper in conversation and be able to understand where we're coming from and what do we know, because each of us, we may have common concerns and topics, but each of us is going to add something new that is just based on our journey and the things we've learned.
That's exactly it. I think I'm hearing that more and more recently, which is giving me a lot of hope. Like, people, I think, are really hungry, as you've stated, for that type of space and that kind of conversation. And also not being tied to an outcome right away, not just like, okay, well, and therefore now let's build this thing. Because again, this is going to be an ongoing thing for us. This is a journey. We can create ideas and then we test those ideas, and then we'll be able to see what were some of our working assumptions, and maybe we know a little bit more now. And I believe so much in that kind of iterative way of being. I believe so much in having a hypothesis and testing it. I mean, all the stuff you learned in sixth grade science, I mean, really applies to a lot of this. And I think people are really eager to not be so tied to a singular conversation, 30-minute meeting, and then therefore here's the outcome, here's the full strategy. Like, we need to let things breathe a little bit. And again, I think the word that you're using, the paradigm shift, that phrase alone is huge. And when I think of paradigm shifts, again, it really a lot of the times just starts with singular ideas that then get socialized, that then get tested, that then get interrogated, and then you go back and there's a new idea and there's a new, way or approach of thinking about the challenges or the opportunities that we see. So there's a lot of that I think, like, the more we could just kind of be proactive about what could a world look like that is inherently more equitable, or what could a world look like that prioritizes human flourishing or the human experience. The more we can just sit with that and be okay with the fact that it feels nebulous, the fact that it feels vague and fuzzy, that's okay, because you're not meant to come out of that immediately with solutions or a PowerPoint. Like, there's going to be some work in a space of community, getting your stakeholders together, soliciting input, having new questions that you can ask. Like, there's a process here, and it's a worthwhile process, because on the other side of that, we're not just going to be reactive. One of the things, like, if in a different space and time, I would love to get into policy making from a foresight lens, right? Not just being reactive, like, oh, now we're in crisis, now we have to come up with a thing. It's like, is there a way to anticipate some of these things and be a bit more prepared, and really start to see emerging issues before they become a crisis? Because the world is constantly giving us signals, and we may not necessarily be paying attention, but nothing that is happening is new or shocking. It's just that maybe we were paying attention to other things. So, different space and time, but those are the types of things that I think about when I hear you talk about this paradigm shift. It's like a tectonic plate, right? You don't feel it moving. The earth doesn't feel like it's moving, but it is moving.
And fast.
Enough, yeah. Stand still enough, you're like, oh, okay.
I was in a conversation earlier, and we were talking about similar topics but different angle. And this person brought up Abraham Lincoln's famous quote about, if you give me 6 hours to cut a tree, I'll spend 5 sharpening my ox.
Yeah.
I think this is what we're tapping into. Like, we need that type of incubation. That's where the growth, the introspection, the imagination, that we just talked about, which Tyler also brought up in the comments. That is where the richness of this comes from, in order to get to a point where we feel like, oh, now we can shift to this direction, and everybody participated, to your point, of that process, which is fully enriching.
Yeah.
I wanna transition to the other point. So, decolonization. I saw a clip this morning or yesterday of somebody talking about decolonization from an art perspective. She was talking about the hidden talent in sectors of not privilege, and the perception that somebody with with power and money and access may create mediocre art, and that would be totally celebrated and exposed, and it'll go into magnificent media and exposure, while somebody in an underrepresented, underprivileged sector may have even more creative art, like those kids that do graffitis on the streets, and they may be considered, right, that they are damaging uh, the environment, when in fact they're both expressions, creative expressions to create art, and it's the perception of whether or not we are in a privileged, you know, part of this or not, which may inhibit those talents to be known and to be celebrated and to contribute to those type of conversations as to where the future needs to go.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that particular issue?
Oh yeah. I definitely have thoughts on that.
I
It's so
thought
funny.
you would.
Yeah, it's so funny that you're even saying that because literally right on my desk right now, I went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and there's this
Yeah.
exhibit currently up called Of God and Country. And if I open it up, the very first page talks about the way they curated the exhibit. And the way they curated it was
Yeah.
actually finding artists who are not formally trained, who come from a range of backgrounds, who consider themselves to be outsiders of this artistic space. They have no artistic training. They're self-taught. And if you look at, some of the work that came out of it, I mean, really beautiful things. I don't know if you'll be able to see it in the camera, but just
Yeah.
really beautiful pieces of art. And there's a whole exhibit for those who are local to the area. I mean, some people made sculptures, some people did paintings. So I say all that to say, like, this is my language. Is
Yeah.
There is not a single country or city I've traveled to where I don't try to go find the local artists, because I truly think if I want to understand more closely enough about that city, enough about that country, enough about the history and the people, I got to go find the artists. That's just something that I gravitate towards. But I think a lot of what you're hinting at with this concept, Lindsay, is it's also a little bit of a mindset shift in and of itself, because in order for us to appreciate those perspectives, those points of views, it begins with the intent. And the intent, if the intent is consumption, then it's going to be largely based on brand and notoriety and who gets to call themselves this, an artist
Futurist
or a
or
futurist,
futurist.
anything, right? But if the intent is to learn, if the intent is to appreciate, the intent is to preserve, if the intent is something I think about a lot is regeneration. If that's the intent, then your sources will be different, and that's why I believe so much in this practice that I'm building, because our point of inquiry is not direct sort of questions that will get you to stick to your talking points. The point of inquiry is to understand what are those deeper human truths that maybe you just didn't have space to expose before. So if the intent is to learn, and if the intent is to be slow, steady, and real and grounded and foundational, then that's where you would go. And it's not to diminish the work of people who have been trained and people who have spent the time learning these skills. It's certainly not to diminish that. But I think it's really important for us to think about what we think about, look at why do we look where we look, or how do we associate things, or what are our affiliations with those things. And I think a lot of it is a mindset shift of like, am I here to consume a thing, or am I here to get and give, right? That sort of circular motion, that regeneration, like that in and of itself, I think creates a different desire, and creates a different appreciation for in this case, an artist who is not formally trained.
Yeah. I mean, it creates a different blueprint too. I believe in that too. And even though from my perspective, I come from the point of view of why do companies grow? What is their motive to become bigger and more expansive? Right, and invest in them, and like it comes from the same points of the intentionality and how that builds into their own vision for growth, and how the human capacity underneath it, it's the force to
Yeah.
make it happen, right? So we're just not growing at all cost and creating all kinds of damage and bringing people, laying off people, and but it's more conscientious, which I think applies to your individual development.
Oh yeah.
If you don't become self-aware, to Paul's earlier point, in your intent as a human being and what drives you and what are your values, then your decisions are going to be throwing arrows and probably hurting other people.
Mm.
I think it's an amazing, it's a game changer, and it's talked about a lot, but I feel like the execution of it is what gets lost, depending on the level of profound inquiry, to your point, that you can get in, to connect with that core of what it means to be human in that context.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the times the input, it's the same as an algorithm, it's the same as most things. The input is going to dictate the output. What we get is a result of what was put in. And I think, even that in and of itself is an opportunity, because if you, again, the intention is part of that. But if all we're putting in is, let's say, greed, um, let's say power, if those are the things, the
Mhm.
principles that we are operating under, and those are the things we're putting in, then that's kind of all we get on the other side, or the byproducts of that are what we get on the other side. So I think a lot of my reframe is like, okay, well, what if we put
Mhm.
in curiosity? What if we put
Mhm.
in compassion? What if
Mhm.
we put in liberation? I'm just giving those as an examples, but what if you put those things in? What if that becomes the source? Then what happens on the other side, I would like to believe, could inherently be better.
Yeah. I have a couple more questions, and then we're going to start wrapping up. There's a comment I want to bring up based on something you mentioned around human flourishing. So it's definitely ideal for the future, as opposed to just many being in survival mode. I mean, that whole idea of survival mode is a whole topic in itself,
Yeah.
because I feel like we have internalized it as the way of living,
Yeah.
and it's hard to break through those patterns of belief and behavior when it comes to that. But let me tie my last point from earlier to the next question, which is the role of power, right? Businesses have a huge amount of economic power, influence power, market power, employment power, right? And from my point of view, sometimes it blows my mind that we would not use that power for like expanding abundance out into the world, but just for the benefit of a few. And so I would love to know your perspective on that type of transformative power that businesses have, not only for their own benefit, but for what they contribute in society at large. And
Mm.
what would you think? How do you think it can be leveraged for the benefit of humans at this point?
Yeah. I mean, the core premise of, I used to do marketing strategy, right? So the thing I used to think about all the time was, how many people can we reach and how quickly can we scale, whatever it is, whether it's a product
Mm-hmm.
or a portfolio or anything. So I think when you think about the scalability and the reach of
Mm-hmm.
businesses, period, just by function of how capitalism works,
Mm-hmm.
that inherently to me is opportune when it comes to anything, right? Like the thing we export more often than not are ideologies or belief systems, or in
Mm-hmm.
addition to the things that you're actually selling, there's the byproduct of that a lot of the times is social norms, and cultures, and the way
Mm-hmm.
we speak and slang and all these things that get spread. And particularly coming out of the United States, there's a way that, I mean, this country connects global markets in so many ways, because one, we have an influx of people like myself who were not born in this country, who come here, and there's a contribution that happens there. But then with you bring new ideas and new ideologies and new tastes and new flavors and new everything. And the combination of that at scale is wild. It's crazy when you really think about the
Mm-hmm.
potential of that. And so I think, businesses connect the global markets. businesses in a lot of ways are facilitating that cultural exchange, whether it's their direct intention or not. That's what's happening. Um, and then there's just a way with, with economic power, the ways that that can then foster, just again, I think about regeneration. What can you put back in to source more? What's the knowledge that you can impart? What is a layer of cooperation that you now can create across these different sectors of society? Like, I just think like businesses ultimately are in just a new space. There's just a new opportunity for a different type of leadership that we may not necessarily see in other sectors. Like, there's a conversation to be had about innovation, and the ways that we think about innovation is just simply being a plurality of ideas and where those ideas are sourced from. And let's not forget that businesses also employ a considerable part of our population, and so you have a lot of people that have an opportunity to contribute their talent to something. But what is the thing, right? And what we're seeing more and more is that people want to contribute their talent to something that they think is actually enhancing quality of life beyond themselves. Like, this is a growing desire among, I teach part-time, so you talk to a lot of business students these days, and it's kind of what they want to see. Like, of course they want to make money, they want to live a good life, but they also want to understand, like, what am I actually influencing? What am I advocating for via this organization that I work for? And so there's just a whole host of things. The thing that employs you contributes to a wider livelihood. It is integral to parts of your identity and the ways that you're able to exist in society. So there's just a lot of power there, inevitably, that I think we should really be taking advantage of as business leaders. We should really look at the ways that creates a new role for us to play, and how the future gets thought about and how the future actually gets designed. And, kind of without repeating everything I already said.
That is fabulous. I adore you. I'm so glad that we're on the same wavelength, in that we can sit down and just have these conversations, and hopefully get people to hear your perspective, get people to see that these conversations are possible, that they're necessary, that it doesn't cost anything, and that everybody has a little bit to contribute. And if we all do that in our in our walks of life, we can actually push for something more meaningful. I don't want to say goodbye without giving you an opportunity to maybe share your top 3 things that you want people to remember about you when they either catch up with the recording or later on if they want to connect with you. So I'll give you the stage to say goodbye and share that.
Oh my goodness. Number one, something I already shared, is that the future is not a time or a place. It is a space that we are actively participating in and contributing to. I would say number 2, a lot of people oftentimes ask me, why don't you work with kids? Why don't you work with children? They're the future. As long as you're alive, you are part of the future. You have a right to play and a role to play in how this wider human experience shapes up. So let's not go to the graduations and tell the kids, like, okay, you're the future, and then hand them a world that they won't know what to do with. Let's actually be part of creating the shifts and the changes that we actually want to see. And I think 3 is, let's embrace some of the foundational aspects of what has always persisted and what has always allowed for human flourishing, and even in the worst of conditions. And what that thing is each other, and caring about each other, and seeing ourselves as inherently interconnected. And that in and of itself is a core premise of what has gotten us through the past. What is actively getting most of us through the present is this connection right here, is actively a part of getting me through the present. And it's going to be the same thing that persists in what helps us navigate the many futures that could exist. So those are the 3 things I would leave, but always happy to continue the conversation with anyone who is interested, and anyone who wants to understand how they can participate in this thing of the future that I keep talking about. So
That's
thank
so
you, Lindsay.
beautiful. Oh my gosh, thank you. Thank you for your time. I cherish this, and I will definitely protect this recording for the times to come, because there's a lot of these that will start manifesting, and we will come back to this conversation like, see, we talked about it 7 years ago.
I
All right.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right. I'm going to say goodbye. And thank you for everybody who participated today. Thank you, Tameka.
Bye, everybody.